Star Wars fans are all trying to get their hands on the latest limited edition product to come out of the franchise. Is it a new lightsaber? A functional life-size BB-8? Nope, it's milk. Blue milk. It comes out of these ugly things, and despite only being in one scene, it's clearly popular enough to not just be served at the theme park, but now as a limited edition milk you can buy at the grocery store. But even though it was only in that one scene, this milk is actually the franchise's true villain because it should have killed Luke. Hello Internet, welcome to Food Theory, where our lightsabers are blue and so is our milk. For those of you not on the up and up with all things in a galaxy far, far away, Star Wars Day is coming up this weekend, specifically on May the 4th. In case you don't get it, the pronunciation of the date sounds like the popular phrase, "May the Force be with you" in the movies. The holiday has been celebrated for decades at this point, pretty much ever since the movies first released. But the first recorded use of the phrase wasn't even in any connection to the movies or their releases. It was used to congratulate Margaret Thatcher on her victory in becoming the Prime Minister of the UK. Yeah, Star Wars fans have political PR to thank for their holidays catchphrase. But that's obviously not the only thing to come out of the commemorative day. I'm talking all sorts of toys, apparel, accessories, and yes, even food. The most recent release that has people clamoring to get some for themselves is blue milk. It's literally what it sounds like. Milk that is blue. But fans are elated that they finally get to try this drink that appeared in exactly one scene in 11 movies. The real world product is being released in limited locations and for a limited time by TrueMoo. You know, the chocolate milk company that's expanded to now include things like strawberry milk, mint vanilla milk, and oh God, orange cream milk? Well, luckily for everyone with taste buds, this blue milk is simply just slightly vanilla flavored with some coloring. I tried getting my hands on some, but the limited locations as of the writing of this episode are apparently exclusively in the city of Chicago. Nothing in California, Texas, New York, or even North Carolina. But regardless, I'm not interested in the real world product. Obviously, that's just plain old cow's milk at the end of the day. My focus today is on the fictional drink, milked from the creatures called Banthas in the universe. Luke was clearly a fan, so I need to know, what would it taste like? And why is it blue? But above all of that, was it truly safe to drink? Now, I like Star Wars as much as the next guy, but my return was less of the Jedi and more of the King, so I'm definitely gonna need some outside help with this. You know what that means? I'm getting a crossover of my own with Lee.
Hey, you called?
Whoa, yeah, that was freaky fast.
I've been waiting for one of these.
Well, here's your chance. What can you tell me about Banthas?
Their milk is blue. You need more. Well, they're large hairy mammals with huge spiraling horns. They stand around 2 to 2.5 meters tall. They can weigh around 4,000 kilos. They're mainly used for transportation by the Tusken Raiders.
Oh, the people that Anakin
Sure, yeah. But they're an entire race of people, and they've domesticated the Bantha to the point where they're practically inseparable when you talk about them. Like, their bond is insane. When a Bantha dies before their raider, the raider is cast out of their clan to go on a quest to either die in isolation or be adopted by another Bantha.
That's pretty metal, not gonna lie. But what can you tell me about their biology?
Besides being huge and hairy, they're omnivorous, though the desert land of Tatooine has them mostly subsisting off of grasses and other faunas, but they eat plenty of fruits too. Oh, and they can go without water or food for a super long period of time.
Because of the desert?
Yeah, but they're also known to live in all sorts of extreme environments. Like, their fur can help them keep both really cool or really warm.
Interesting. Okay, last question, super fast. Why is their milk blue?
You tell me, food theorist.
Fine. Well, having a better idea of what these things look like, where they can live, and what they eat helps us a lot. Now we know that they tend to live in extreme environments, like the arid Tatooine deserts, and they're pretty freaking huge. Unfortunately, as far as the color of their milk, there's literally nothing in the astonishingly extensive Bantha lore that explains the hue. Even the part of the movie where the milk steals the scene doesn't acknowledge it. Luke doesn't drink it and go, "Uncle Owen, I was gonna go to Tachi Station for some power converters," but only after I finish this creamy blue milk that has notes of vanilla and cinnamon? The only thing the scene does give us is a small glimpse of the consistency. When Luke picks up the jar, we see the liquid sloshing around pretty quickly and violently, meaning it was most likely fairly watery. We can see it better when he actually pours himself the glass. There's also a deleted scene of Beru preparing breakfast and getting the blue milk into the jar from a dispenser, which gives us another good look at the watery consistency of the liquid. Unfortunately, consistency alone doesn't tell us much about the flavor and color other than guesstimating the water content. If we want to figure out why it looks the way it does, first first, we have to understand why the milk we drink is typically white in the first place. You may remember way back in our Hot Ones episodes, we talked about casein quite a bit. It's one of the two types of protein in cow's milk, and the one that binds to capsaicin to help you cool down after a spicy bite. But that's not all it does. Casein molecules also form a natural structure called a micelle in the milk water by binding to minerals like calcium to form. Micelle is a chemical term. Essentially, it's what large molecules form into because they're too big to be soluble. So they form this spherical shape in order to stay suspended in the water as if they were soluble. The reason this affects the color in the milk is because fats and micelles in the milk cause light to refract and scatter. This prevents color absorption and leads to the milk appearing white. So it's the chemical composition of milk that gives it the color. If Bantha milk is blue, then we have to understand the chemical makeup of their milk. Bad news is there's very little information on that, which is crazy considering the Star Wars fandom. Want an entire page on the stripes of Han Solo's pants? You got it. An article dedicated to an unidentified duck individual? Yup. I guess the arbitrary line is drawn at milk. So in lieu of any in-universe information, we gotta look at the closest thing we can find in the real world. The design of Banthas was based on two real-world animals, the muskox and the bighorn sheep. Don't need to tell you what they took from the bighorn sheep, but the muskox is where they clearly took inspiration for the Bantha's coat and general look. IRL, the milk from both of these animals is rare for us to use, but we know that it's white like most milk we're used to. Thing is, bighorn sheep milk is a bit removed from domesticated cow, goat, or sheep's milk, and there's a considerable difference in the fat content. Where regular cow milk has a fat percentage of around 3% for whole milk, bighorn milk hovers around 8%, almost 3 times more. And the problem here is that milk with higher fat content will be more viscous and wouldn't appear nearly as runny as the blue milk we see in the scene. Muskox milk is still rare, but some people have taken to putting it in their coffee. It makes me shudder at the thought, but apparently it's rich and fatty and not offensive in flavor. So basically it didn't make them immediately vomit, so they figured they'd chuck it in their morning joe. It looks a bit thicker than the blue milk, which makes sense considering the muskox doesn't produce much milk to begin with, so what milk they do produce is high in fat for their offspring. This means we aren't gonna get a satisfactory answer here, especially when you take into consideration the extreme temperatures that banthas live in and how that would affect their milk. So obviously what we have to do is look at animals in the real world that live in extreme conditions like the banthas do. Now, like Lee was kind enough to share with us, they live in both extreme hot and cold climates. They can also go without water for a long time. Sound familiar? Like a certain desert dweller? Yup, the good old camel. Turns out camel milk is something of a cool growing trend. Even Kim Kardashian's drinking it. It's super high in vitamin C, iron, and a bunch of other things compared to cow's milk, and has less lactose, which is good news for those of you intolerant to it. But for our mission today, their milk isn't much help. For one, it's as white as cow milk. And despite it being much lower in fat, it's high in proteins which cause it to foam up extremely easily. Great for your vanilla camel frappuccinos, but not for comparing it to Bantha milk, which very clearly did not foam up in its appearances. So despite having similar diets and environments, camels clearly need to give more protein to their young than Banthas do. Struck out again. But maybe looking at the other extreme might provide some useful information. On the other end of the climate spectrum, in the cold, you have the mighty polar bear. Now, we don't know much about polar bear milk because if you get close enough to milk a polar bear, let alone actually try to do it, you're gonna look like the Jedi Temple after Anakin was done with it. Too soon? That said, we do have some information. One mad lad researcher did get to try some polar bear milk and described it as a rich, marine, earthy, chalky taste with a finish vaguely reminiscent of fish. Yum? It makes sense though. They eat seals. Of course it's gonna be fishy. But unlike the protein-heavy camel, their milk is extremely fatty because they love to munch on seal blubber. They depend on it to develop a nice layer of fat that keeps them warm in the super cold temperatures and can help keep them alive when food is hard to find. What this means for us is that the fat, like we established, will make their milk white. It's also high in minerals that their cubs need, so the water content will be lower and make it more viscous than what we're looking for. Once again, this leaves us without blue or runny milk, but it does tell us that their diet is a major factor in the taste. The other thing that none of these animals we've looked at so far check off the list is that they're all much smaller than the Bantha. So maybe it's time we pick on something their own size. And the only land mammal that checks that box is none other cooler than the elephant. This isn't just me throwing a dart at the board here either. In the first movie, Episode 4, A New Hope, the animal they used for the Bantha was an elephant. Now, while the production team used an Asian elephant, the closest thing would actually be the African bush elephant. While they are slightly taller and heavier than Banthas, they can both have similar desert habitats. African elephant milk is extremely high in water content, meaning it's far more runny than anything else we've seen so far. As far as the flavor goes, elephant milk is slightly bitter, and with the diet similar to Bantha's, one that includes fruits, unlike the camel, it's not out of this galaxy to assume Bantha milk would have a similar bitter taste. We're finally getting closer. The only thing we don't know much about is what elephant milk looks like. Once again, we're stuck at the dreaded color, the freaking blue da-boo-dee-da-boo-da. I gotta tell you, I was so close to just throwing in the towel here, but I decided to shift my focus away from exotic animals for a second and take a look at a milk that we have way more information about: human breast milk. Yeah, my search history is definitely raised some eyebrows at the CIA, but that's neither here nor there, because this is where we can finally get some answers. You see, it's actually not uncommon for breast milk to come in a variety of colors, like pink or green and even blue. Why? It turns out it has to do with the fat content. Milk that's lower in fat tends to take on a bluish tint. It's only when more fats get involved that it turns back to a white or off-white color. It all goes back to the micelles. The larger those are, the more light gets scattered and the whiter the milk appears. Things like skim milk have the micelles artificially removed and can take on that blue tint, but the remaining micelles are still fairly large and still scatter the light, which is why it looks fairly white. Elephant milk, on the other hand, has smaller micelles, about half the size of the ones in cow milk. Elephant milk also has roughly 100 times the protein that cow milk does, namely casein. And while the micelles that casein forms with fat don't absorb light at all, casein itself scatters blue light really effectively. This is called the Tyndall effect, and it can make things look blue. That's why the sky is blue. So there you have it. If your kid ever asks you that question, you can finally answer it with confidence. You can even try this for yourself too. Get a glass of skim milk or dilute some milk with water and shine a flashlight through it to see the effect. So what does this mean for Bantha milk? Well, if it's similar to elephant milk with extremely high protein levels but low fat and small micelle structures, it could very easily appear blue. It would also be the reason why it's so runny and wouldn't foam up as readily as camel milk. As far as the taste goes, it would most likely be a little bit salty and bitter, but still fairly reminiscent of the cow milk that you and I drink. It may not be the tastiest thing, but let's face it, it's a desert planet. You gotta take what you get. There is a small problem though. Luke would have died drinking this every day. Remember the 4 things we had to keep in mind with the blue milk? The viscosity of the milk, its color, the extreme environments that banthas live in, and their huge size. See, growing to that enormous stature takes a lot of nutrients, especially for those bones, their joints, and their cartilage. Elephants deal with the same thing. That's why elephant milk has a compound called glucosamine. We have it too, and it's used by the body to make other chemicals that build tendons, ligaments, cartilage, and the fluid that surrounds joints. As you can imagine, elephants need a lot of it. Their milk contains 128 times the amount found in cow's milk. In normal, safe amounts, glucosamine doesn't do anything bad to us, but doses that are too high and over a prolonged period of time can cause nausea, diarrhea, stomach pain, hair loss, hepatitis, and liver failure, which can cause a pretty bad case of being dead. Since banthas have a similar size as elephants, plus those massive horns, their milk would most likely contain a comparable amount of glucosamine for them to grow big and strong, which means that if Luke had a glass of blue milk every day for breakfast, his liver would have given out long before Vader ever had a chance to tell him he was his father. But hey.
Actually, Luke Skywalker isn't technically human, so...
Dude! Episode's over. Didn't you hear me say, but hey? I don't go over to Film Theory and ruin your sign-offs.
Fine. I'm sorry. He would have died. Happy?
Very. Thank you. But hey, that's just a theory. A food theory. Bon appetit.